As I said last week, I welcome this invitation and the opportunity to talk about this terribly important topic at Burke. I'm talking about the history of race and religion in American Presbyterianism in this series of 3 talks. I'm focusing on primarily on the mainline Presbyterian churches. There have been a lot of splinter churches, but for the most part, the story I'm telling is about the larger, more prominent, more influential Presbyterian churches in this country. Last week, I talked about slavery, a period running from, in the Presbyterian case, the early 1700s through, of course, 1860, the time of the Civil War. And even if you were here last week, you might find it convenient for me to summarize a few points, so let me do that. One of the main things I emphasized last time is that from at least the 1700s and certainly the 1800s, there have been Black Presbyterians in this country. Black Presbyterian congregations from the early 1800s on. And that's a very important part of the story I'm going to be telling. A second theme of my remarks last time was to stress that there was considerable participation and acquiescence in the institution of slavery by white Presbyterians. And this is an overwhelmingly white church. It was from the beginning, and it has been ever since. It continues to be that way today, of course. The Black Presbyterians from the get-go criticized, indicted the institution of slavery, said that it was wrong, that it should be eliminated. But on the whole, not entirely, white Presbyterians tended to ignore that and were acquiescent in, or in some cases, actively embraced the institution of slavery. But, and this is the theme I emphasized toward the end of my remarks last time, in that period, especially the period leading up to the founding of the American Republic and beyond, leading to the Civil War, a period of roughly 100 years, there was active debate and contestation among white Presbyterians about the legitimacy of the institution of slavery. I stress that because sometimes you hear people say, well, they didn't know any better back then. Everybody accepted. Nonsense. They were confronted with the witness of Black Presbyterians who said this was wrong, and some white Presbyterians took that message very seriously to heart. And as a result, there was very serious conflict among mainline Presbyterians during that period over the institution of slavery. Indeed, at the time of the founding of the church in the 1780s, there were pronouncements by synods and eventually the General Assembly saying that slavery needed to be abolished. But in spite of that, there was a reluctance to enforce those regulations, those claims by judicatories very significantly. And if you were here last time, you will remember toward the end of my remarks, I compared white Presbyterians with Quakers on that issue. The Quakers rather systematically enforced their commitment to the abolition of slavery, whereas white Presbyterians were on the whole reluctant to do so, being concerned with the peace and unity of the church. Now, with that background, I want today to talk about the successor to slavery, which is, of course, segregation, a distinct chapter in the history of race relations in this country. And I'm going to give you dates on that running from roughly the 1890s through the 1950s. So the epic of segregation, when segregation was a live issue in American life, actively enforced and accepted as legitimate by most whites. That's the period of the 1890s through the 1950s. Indeed, not only was its legitimacy accepted, but it was enforced in law, in civil law, so that it had real governmental muscle behind it. In my presentation today, I want to talk about that period, 1890s through the 1950s, in 3 parts. I want to begin by talking about what it was, Some of us, people my age, can remember, especially if you were exposed to life in the South, in Virginia, for example, as I was as a college student in the 1950s. I remember well certain dramatic manifestations of it. That is at the very end of the era. So some of us who are of a certain age probably can remember, especially if we're exposed to any of the practices that went with segregation, we can remember what it was like in the very waning days of segregation. I'll talk about that first, what it was. Secondly, I want to talk about, for reasons that I hope will become evident as I make this presentation, I want to talk about the response of Black Presbyterians to the institutions and practices that constituted segregation. And then finally, in the last part of my remarks, I'll be talking about the response of white Presbyterians, again, primarily but not exclusively mainline white Presbyterians in that period. And I have to make a very important distinction even before I get to that topic, and that is that from 1861 on, you had a division among mainline Presbyterian churches between the Southern Church and the Northern Church, because at the time of the Confederacy, a series of Presbyterian churches in the states of the Confederacy separated from the PCUSA, as it was known then, to create the Presbyterian Church of Confederate States. Now, the important thing to note about that is that that occurred in the 1860s, and that wound, if you will, that division in American Presbyterianism was not healed for more than a century. Finally, there was church union in the 1980s. I want to stress that in the 1980s. It took a long time for that Presbyterian division to be overcome. And I might add, the Presbyterians were rather late in that kind of division. Methodists had gone through it before. The Methodists had come back together, South and North, much sooner. But in the Presbyterian case, it took all the way into the 1980s. And I think it's very clear that even though there were all kinds of overtures for church union starting in the 1950s, the main thing that prevented that union from taking place, that reunion from taking place, was attitudes, at least in the South, with regard to race. I'll come back and talk about that as we go along. So, in talking about the white response, I'll have to distinguish between the Southern Church, as it was known, as it was characterized during the time of its existence, and the Northern Church. The word segregation, in its etymology, refers to something rather innocent: separation. Separate this and that. You can imagine all kinds of things being separated, being pulled apart, without necessarily any invidious, especially morally and spiritually invidious connotations. But in the minds of people who have any understanding of what segregation represented with regard to this particular topic, you have to say it was not innocent in the least. It was not innocent at all. In actuality, the whole set of institutions that represented segregation were invented by white people and imposed upon the Black population with very strong resistance from the Black population. That opposition, that resistance was not always overt. Sometimes it was subterranean, but it's very clear, especially in the Presbyterian side, especially when you look to what Black Presbyterians were saying. It's very clear that Black Presbyterians were, in their own way, as opposed to segregation as they were to slavery. Keep that in mind as I go along and talk this evening. It was a set of institutions that predated the Civil War in a certain sense. One of the things I think it's important for those of us who, I came from the Midwest and a northern state, and when I first confronted segregation, I thought of it as a Southern institution, and in a sense it was. But it's important to know, if you're going to be historically accurate, that all sorts of segregation existed before the Civil War in the North. All sorts of segregation existed before the Civil War in the North. It was not as codified, it was not as legally enforced, as it came to be in the South, but Southerners oftentimes said, once the institutions of slavery were up and running after the Civil War in the 1890s and after, well, we're just copying what our brothers and sisters in the North have already done. That was a half-truth, but there certainly was more than a little truth to it. It was a set of elaborate institutions and practices that were created, really, in effect, to try to put back into the bottle the energies, vitality, which had been created by the aftermath of slavery through Reconstruction. Reconstruction was a great period of liberation for Blacks when they got the vote, when they got all kinds of freedoms that previously they hadn't existed in the South. And after a period in which they enjoyed those freedoms, and those freedoms were characterized by Black authors, Frederick Douglass and others, as a kind of golden moment in the development of the Black experience in the United States, there was, of course, a lot of resistance to it and resentment about it on the part of whites, especially when they got over their initial fears that their lives were going to be completely destroyed by emancipation of Blacks. Then they began to push back, and especially as the federal government began to withdraw from the South. It was the federal military presence in the South was the enforcement mechanism. And as deals were made in the 1870s and then on into the 1880s, gradually the pressure on Southern whites was released. And then you had the imposition of these laws and practices which separated systematically the two races. Separate dwellings, separate education, separate political opportunities. A very important part of segregation was the denial of the political rights that had been given to Blacks in the period of Reconstruction. And of course, a lot of it had to do not simply with what was codified in law, and there were all kinds of laws that were put on the books, now known as Jim Crow laws, which forced, if you will, Blacks on pain of criminal accusations being made against them to accept this. All of that, and then it was, you might say, informally enforced by a regime of terror that, of course, came from largely the Ku Klux Klan. Informal enforcement, intimidation, designed as much as possible to prevent any kind of active resistance from this on the part of the Black population. Now, the thing I think that made it work, a very important part of this story to understand, is that it was accepted and eventually enforced by the federal government. Let me say that again. Accepted and enforced by the federal government. And there are two dramatic illustrations of that that are worth mentioning in this very quick summary of what is, in fact, a very elaborate and complex phenomenon. And those of you who are interested in this topic, maybe by the time this series is over, I can commend a few books to you as sources on this. They're well worth reading just to get a sense of the flow of American history on this topic. One is a very important decision that was handed down by the Supreme Court in 1896, the famous Plessy versus Ferguson decision. It was a ruling by the Supreme Court which legitimized the creation of separate facilities, Black-white facilities on public transportation. Very important issue at the time. How do you get from one place to another, especially how do you travel from one state to another? Interstate transportation. And in that decision, which was not quite a unanimous decision, but a majority decision, you get the famous phrase, which symbolizes so much of the whole ethos of this segregation phenomenon: separate but equal. Separate but equal. And of course, the irony is what it legitimized was something which was anything but equal. It was separate and unequal. And this was the kind of legal signal from the courts that the federal courts were going to accept a whole series of institutions that took away much of what was granted in the immediate aftermath of the Civil War. The other thing is very important, I think, to mention in this context where we're talking about Presbyterian history. It has to do with Woodrow Wilson and his presidency. I'm sure most of you know that Woodrow Wilson was a devout Presbyterian, and in a certain sense, a kind of model Presbyterian, because he was a child of the manse. His father was a distinguished clergyman. As a matter of fact, spent much of his pastorate in Stanton, Virginia. Wilson himself was learned in Reformed theology. He was a layman, of course, but he was very proudly sort of reflecting in his public statements, in particular, his Presbyterian beliefs. But he was a Southerner, and he was a firm believer in the rightness of segregation. Let me say that again. Woodrow Wilson was a firm believer in the rightness of segregation. He never went so far as I know to declare that it was biblical, but he certainly thought it was morally right. He said the races need to be kept separate. That is the will of God. The races need to be kept separate. That is the will of God. And then he went on to say, and of course, the blacks need the tutelage of whites. Now, why is that important? Because when he came to office, he segregated the civil service. The civil service had been moving towards a kind of desegregated quality, going all the way back to the 1870s. By the way, this affects very much the ethos of the city of Washington when you think about it. Blacks had gotten some opportunities in the federal government to achieve a certain middle class status. Woodrow Wilson was convinced that this was wrong. And so he did everything in his power, starting with executive orders to resegregate, from going all the way back to the pre-Civil War period, the civil service. And there is a record of a remarkable meeting that took place in the White House between Woodrow Wilson and a series of clergy, most of whom were Black Presbyterians. Now, just imagine this. I've oftentimes thought this could be the stuff of a really good play. These ministers pleaded with him. One of them had written a long letter to him. Francis Grimke, who's, in my opinion, one of the great heroic figures of the history of American Presbyterianism, a Black minister who for many years was the pastor of the 15th Street Presbyterian Church in this city, a historian in DC, which is a historic Black church. Grimke had written a long letter to Woodrow Wilson, pleading with him not to do this, pleading with him to not to do this as a fellow Presbyterian, saying we are all children of God. This is wrong, Mr. President. You need to pray about this. You need to think about this. And he and a bunch of other clergy got a meeting with Wilson, and Wilson flatly refused, lectured them on his views about the appropriateness of racial separation. I could say more about the institution of slavery, but institution of segregation, but let me go on now to talk about the church responses to it, which is my main topic. One of the most interesting things you discover when you get into this topic is the following. The period of Reconstruction and beyond is a period in which there is a remarkable flourishing of Black Protestant Christianity, of Black Protestant Christianity. Up to that point, there had been, I've already emphasized this, Black Presbyterians. I might add, there had been Black Methodists, Black Baptists, Black many different things, growing out of what I talked about last time about the view of many white Christians that they had a responsibility to evangelize the slaves. But up to this point, there had not been terribly much, up to the time of the Civil War, there had not been terribly much development of independent Black church life. Black experience of the church was as an extension of white churches, oftentimes sitting in the balcony, sitting on the lawn outside, as I said last time. You can't get up to the Civil War much segregated religion. It's very interesting. It was a period in which there was very little of that kind of thing. Well, after the Civil War, one of the things that happens, even in the period when segregation is being established and there's all kind of repression of Blacks, one of the things that happens in a kind of remarkable development in that period is the emergence of a whole subculture of Black churches. Even in the South where there is all kinds of pressure on Blacks to sort of go back to their place, not keep in their place, but go back to the place they had in the time of slavery. But for reasons that are complex, one of the things they were allowed to do was to worship on their own. Especially slave owners abdicated any responsibility for Blacks when it came to religion. And so you get a flourishing of Black religious life. In this period, starting in the 1880s and 90s and extending on, there are a whole new world of Black denominations, separate independent Black denominations that begin to develop. They typically have their greatest organizational strength in the North, but they have a lot of effective reach in the South as well. This is the period in which, very important to note, this is the period in which, for example, the AME Church, the great church of, in some respects, of Black Protestantism, the AME Church and the AME Zion Church emerges. These churches are allowed to develop in this period, and you get not only congregations, but higher judicatories, and especially Baptists and Methodists are developing a sort of institutional life of purely Black churches, separate from, parallel to white churches, but with their own identity. Now, the interesting thing from the point of view of Presbyterians, and terribly interesting to my point of view, is this: that separate denominational identity never developed among Black Presbyterians. It did among Methodists, it did among Baptists, but it didn't among Presbyterians and Anglicans either. You don't have an independent Black Presbyterian church. You don't have an independent Black Anglican church. I've already hazarded a hunch about why that was. I think in both cases, those two denominations to which I've referred had a commitment, going back to the slavery days, of education of the Black population. They had a commitment not only to evangelization, but also to education. And I think that's one of the reasons why the people who became Christians and Protestants who were Blacks in those particular denominations were inclined to stay in the larger denomination rather than moving off to create something separate. But having said that, let me qualify it now in an important way. Even though there was no separate ever, as far as I can tell, ever separate Black Presbyterian denomination, nothing comparable to the African Methodist Episcopal Church, AME Church. What did happen, especially in the South, but not just in the South, was the emergence, starting in the 1880s and 90s, and then developing on into the next century, the 20th century, with a whole series of separate Black judicatories, separate Black presbyteries, separate Black synods, and of course, before that, separate Black congregations. Now, what does that mean? Well, it means that in the Presbyterian case, in contrast to the Methodist case, for example, you have a kind of sub-denomination within a denomination, if you follow. A sub-denomination which is Black within a larger denomination which is white. Now, as that plays out, especially in the early part of the 20th century, and I'm going to be getting to that in just a second, it has a fascinating consequence. These people who are, of course, what this produces is leaders, clergy, especially clergy, but not just clergy, lay people rise to positions of leadership in these Black presbyteries, these Black judicatories, but they don't form a separate black General Assembly. Instead, they are funneled into the General Assembly of the larger denomination. This is in the North, not the South. The South just the Southern Presbyterian Church just separated itself from the blacks as though they didn't exist for purposes of church government. But the consequence of that at the highest levels of the denomination is fascinating. Grimke, I've already mentioned. Grimke became, in his own very, very, I would say, articulate way, eloquent way, a kind of voice for Black Presbyterians within a white denomination, and would routinely make important interventions in the debates that took place at the General Assembly. So in the Presbyterian case, you had these Black voices that you had to deal with on the floor of the General Assembly. And I really do believe, I'll get to that later, I think that had an influence on the way the church responded to certain issues. The other thing I want to stress about it, and this is a larger point to be made, not just about Black Presbyterians, but about these Black churches that emerged in the aftermath of the Civil War generally, is the following. They became the center of Black culture for a long time. Let me stress that again. In the period right after the Civil War, as these Black churches emerge, they became, because of the limited freedoms that they had, they became the center of Black culture. They became the source of sort of unified life for the Black community. And that's one of the reasons why, astonishingly, to this day, the Black population is overwhelmingly Christian, overwhelmingly Protestant, and remarkably, it seems to me, adhering to church commitments and church and Christian belief when you might expect them, given the way they've been treated, to migrate in a very different direction. Indeed, in terms of just ordinary statistics about having to do with church membership, church participation in the ongoing life of the church and so forth, they actually have higher rates of commitment than the white population. It's a kind of remarkable thing. And I think it's related to this fact that in a kind of complicated way, there's a strong feeling of attachment to this institution or set of institutions as the root of a culture that was for the longest time of people who were oppressed. It's a very, very interesting thing to reflect on, not only just as a sociological phenomenon, but even as a theological datum. Last thing I want to say about the Black churches in this part of my remarks, and I'm going to be talking about it a lot next time. By the way, let me just say parenthetically, jumping to the conclusion, Martin Luther King did not appear out of a vacuum. There's a whole history that leads up to Martin Luther King and the civil rights movement. And part of what I'm doing here is trying to sketch the background to that. He himself said more than once, I owe an enormous debt to, and then he'd list a long list of names of people who were part of this church development that I've been describing. In the period running from the 1880s up through the 1950s, in the Black churches, there developed a very, very elaborate set of practices with regard to worship, but also a definite set of theological ideas. Some of those theological ideas, I don't want to overstate this point, but some of those theological ideas are what are now characterized as the Black prophetic tradition. The Black prophetic tradition, and I have to say, the Black prophetic tradition was oftentimes articulated, one that had some of its best articulation by Presbyterians like Grimke, who were convinced that segregation had to be confronted. And of course, there was a great debate in the Black community all along about, do you confront or do you accommodate? Let me say that again. Do you confront or do you accommodate? Indeed, that's a whole debate about the essence of the Black attempting to deal with what they viewed as the white problem. There was a lot of talk about the Black problem, but from their point of view, it was the white problem. How do you deal with these people who seem so strongly committed to what, from their point of view, were clearly racist practices? Well, one strain in that whole set of arguments that was developing. And a lot of it had to do with what was preached, but also what was said increasingly to students who were trying to study for the ministry. What sort of theology do you present to them? And this prophetic tradition emphasized things like the following: the Old Testament prophets, the necessity of judging existing institutions in the light of divine justice, God's will for his people. And if you thought in those terms, this is one of the things that Grimke said pretty bluntly to Wilson: if you think in those terms, then probably a lot of things need to happen in this society. The other thing which was very interesting about their preaching, there's a lot of interesting writing being done on this now, is that oftentimes it articulated a kind of interesting blend of Old Testament prophetic ideas and American civil religion. You say you're a democratic nation, or let me rephrase that. You say we're a democratic nation, that all people have rights, that we guarantee the pursuit of happiness for the whole population. We even say sometimes that this is God's chosen nation. Well, if that's true, then what gives with segregation? Isn't this a violation of some of the most basic claims the nation makes about itself? So you had this civil religion blended with Old Testament prophetic themes. White Presbyterians, how did they respond? In keeping with what I said last time, and there's a consistency to it over time, in some respects, a kind of sobering and saddening consistency, I have to say, from my own point of view. There's some of the same stuff that we saw in my summary of white Presbyterian responses to slavery. In the main, I would say, the Presbyterian response, both North and South, although the Southern version of it was more obvious and more predictable in some respects, there was a lot of complicity in segregation and even active endorsement of it. I'm tempted to say it's hard to measure these things. Historians have a great difficulty moving from the claims made by leaders to what ordinary people think and do and say. You can get the text of what a pastor says in a sermon, but what are the people in the pew really thinking? But judging from what people did, there was very little on the part of white Presbyterians. There was very little active resistance to segregation. Very little evidence of active resistance to segregation. The Black brothers and sisters were saying, this is not good, this is wrong, what do we do about this? And on the whole, during this long period that I'm talking about here, the white Presbyterian response was indifference, sometimes even active endorsement, especially in the South. There was what I have to say can only be characterized, they're developed in the Southern Church during this period as a kind of theology of segregation. Segregation, I've already referred to it when I talked about Woodrow Wilson. Woodrow Wilson's views didn't come out of nowhere. They came from, by the way, his father was the first stated clerk of the Presbyterian Church in the South, the Confederate version of the Presbyterian Church. So his father was, you might say, at the sort of center of power of that church. And I think it's probably pretty good, it's pretty reasonable to think that he got the views that he articulated in that meeting to which I referred largely from his own upbringing as a Presbyterian child of the manse. Summarize that view the following way. God created the races separate, and they are meant to stay separate. By the way, the thing above all that is terrible in thinking in those terms is anything that involves intimate mixing of the races. Intermarriage is just unthinkable. Anything that involves intimate blending of the two races is very problematic. Let me just say one final word about that, which is worth noting because we Presbyterians make a great deal about our fidelity to Scripture. I got a question about that last time. And it's a very important topic. If you say that scripture is our guide, well, that immediately leads to debates. Is slavery biblical? And I told you last time there was an enormous debate about that for years and years and years among Presbyterians prior to the Civil War. It's interesting to me that after the Civil War and this phenomenon of segregation emerges, there's not much inclination to say segregation per se is biblical. It's interesting. You know, if you look in scripture for justifications of these policies that I've described, it's very hard to find them. So the tendency was to say something like the following: it is not really biblical directly, but if you think about the Bible a certain way, then you can get there. And it's interesting that L. Nelson Bell, who was the father of Billy Graham's wife, Billy Graham's father-in-law, who was a leader of Southern Presbyterians in the latter phase of this, the 30s and 40s and on into the 50s, and was pressed on this at one point, said, I'm a firm believer in segregation, but I'm not sure you can get a justification for it out of the Bible. And I've oftentimes thought, well, boy, that would be an opening for an interesting conversation with a conservative, with a very theologically conservative figure. By the way, I have to say, just as an aside, Billy Graham and his father father-in-law disagreed about this, and they had rather active, strenuous disagreements. And when it came to running his services, Billy Graham, as much as possible, tried to avoid their being segregated, and even a couple of times made a point of saying they will not be segregated. And even in one particular rally, as it was called at that point, invited Martin Luther King to speak. So there was a clear, shall we say, division in the family about that. Now, having said what I've just said, that the Presbyterians, white Presbyterians, on the whole, put up very little direct resistance to the phenomenon of segregation until, I'm about to say, late in the game. There's one very interesting addition to that doesn't change what I've just said, but complicates it in the following way. You will remember that I made a big point last time of saying Presbyterians, regardless of their position on slavery, whether they were active opponents of it, even at the level of abolitionism, or at the other end of the spectrum, were active proponents of the institution of slavery, they all agreed, and this, you can't quite say this of all of the major Protestant denominations, but Presbyterians tended to agree that people of faith, white people of faith, had a responsibility to evangelize, to educate, and to provide worship opportunities for the Black population. In that sense, they recognized that all of the slave population were human beings, which, if you've done any reading about the debates that took place before the Civil War, that was an issue. Are they human beings or not? Now, within that is a very important element of, I'm tempted to say almost in practical terms, almost one of the defining features of the whole Reformed tradition: an insistence upon education for the whole population, laity as well as clergy. Of course, a very strong emphasis on an educated clergy, but also a strong emphasis upon an educated laity for theological as well as other practical reasons. Not just so that they can be good doctors and lawyers and whatever, but also because they need to be able to read the scriptures and make sense of the scriptures for themselves, and in turn to think about the kinds of issues which are raised by theologically sound preaching. Now, in the time of segregation, that translated into something very important for the Black experience generally, and the Black Presbyterian experience in particular. It translated into an active effort, and this came mainly from the North, not the South. The Southern Church largely walked away from this. You can imagine why. the sort of the part of the country which was most committed to slavery. Once the institution of slavery was demolished, they tended to say, well, okay, let them go their own way. But Northern Presbyterians in particular saw that they had a great responsibility. If they had thought about the fate of this Black population, keep in mind 80% of that population at the time of their emancipation were illiterate. What are we going to do with that population? Typically, what they did was to send legions of missionaries into the South to provide educational opportunities for the freed slaves. Hundreds of missionaries went south. White missionaries went south in order to create schools, create opportunities for learning. And on the whole, the Black population, and especially the Black population who had anything to do with Presbyterians, gravitated to those schools with enthusiasm. Now that produced a significant part, I don't want to say all, but a significant, by the way, the Anglicans did something similar. That produced a significant part of what began to emerge as a small but significant Black middle class. People who were sufficiently well educated that they could aspire to eventually higher education and became lawyers and doctors and clergy, of course, and teachers, a whole segment of the population, and Presbyterians in particular, Black Presbyterians in particular, were the kind of people who had those sorts of aspirations, if not for themselves, for their children. And what emerges out of that also is a whole series of institutes and schools, some of which have survived to this day. The most important one in the South is a historically Black institution, Johnson C. Smith University in North Carolina, which was founded by Presbyterians and created precisely for the purpose I've just been discussing. They'd already created other institutions. I think I mentioned last time the most important of those institutions was one called Lincoln University, or it's now known as Lincoln University in Pennsylvania, Thurgood Marshall's alma mater. These institutions were created at the same time that the institution of segregation was largely being accepted as just that's the way things are. I hope you see how that alone could have important long-term implications. If you step in there and create these institutions, encourage an appetite for education, there is over time the development, as there has been over time, a larger and larger pool of Black African Americans who are educated themselves and have a real desire to spread education in the Black population and beyond. Now, having said all that, I want to go to the final part of my story. I hope I can do this in about 10 minutes, which is the exceptions to the white Presbyterian acquiescence in and acceptance of segregation. I said last time that there were in the ranks of Presbyterians, white Presbyterians, some people who were adamantly opposed to slavery, and they actively opposed it. They took steps to try to bring about its downfall. They were a minority. I wagered the view that they were only a segment of the Presbyterian world. And I also credited them, however, with, at certain points in the development of the struggle over slavery, achieving real ascendancy in the judicatories of the church. They didn't quite pull off drawing the church unambiguously into an anti-slavery position, but they certainly were clear, active opponents of the institution of slavery. Now, I can't say that there was exactly the same thing in the case of segregation, but I can say the following. In the early part of the 20th century, the early 1900s, you begin to detect, if you look carefully, it's not the whole story. Keep in mind, the early part of the 20th century is also the era in which Woodrow Wilson is really coming into his own. But the early part of the 20th century, there is some evidence of what kind of questioning of segregation on the part of white Protestants generally. I would say white Protestants in mainline churches in particular, who are at the center of, insofar as the churches have political influence, it's the mainline Protestant churches. You can see some evidence there of the beginning, just the beginnings of a serious questioning of the institutions and practices of segregation. And I want to suggest to you that that opposition is localized in really a couple of institutions. The first of those institutions is theological seminaries. By the way, it's oftentimes said, I think, that academic institutions are useful to society, and typically what is said when people talk about that is that they produce students who can move into jobs in the wider society that are useful to the wider society. That's one function of academic institutions, but another function of institutions, academic institutions, is to act as incubators of ideas that the wider society is reluctant to embrace. Let me say that again. Incubators of ideas that the wider society is reluctant to embrace. In part, there's a kind of protection that's given by the very vocation of academic life. You're asked to reflect critically on things that most people just take for granted. They have to get up and go do their job, and they haven't got time to read a lot of books. Well, a few people in society, in academic institutions in particular, are charged with the responsibility of reading a lot of books and thinking, you might say, extensively about a whole variety of topics, some of which lead to social criticism. Theological seminaries have long played that role in the United States. Let me say that again. Theological seminaries have long played that role in the United States. And in the case of the topic I'm discussing here, they played a rather significant role. I'm referring in particular to theological seminaries in the North in this case, which were typically drawn towards what today are sometimes characterized as liberal theological ideas. But I want to make that more precise. The late 19th century, the early 20th century is the era, if you know anything about the history of theology, of the social gospel. The social gospel is an attempt on the part of people thinking theologically to understand the relationship between basic theological ideas and social structures, social institutions. And in the case of the social gospel, a lot of their attention was focused on the critique of industrialism and industrial relations. Very, very important work was done by some of those figures, applying biblical ideas to the examination of economic institutions, of political institutions, and so forth, even international relations. It's the beginning, actually, of a whole field called social ethics. Now, some of those people were rather critical of the institutions of segregation. And then there was, just toward the end of the period I'm going to be discussing here, the morphing of the social gospel into something else called Protestant neo-orthodoxy. And Protestant neo-orthodoxy I want to represent by two figures in particular, the Niebuhr brothers, about which I'm sure you've heard, Reinhold Niebuhr and Richard Niebuhr. Reinhold Niebuhr and Richard Niebuhr in different ways were quite sharp critics of the institutions of segregation at a time when few others were. I want to refer in particular here to two books that are worth consulting if you're at all interested. One of the most famous books in the history of ethics and the history of theological ethics in particular is one that Reinhold Niebuhr wrote called Moral Man and Immoral Society. Niebuhr had been a pastor in a church in Detroit, involved in industrial relations. His first interest was primarily labor management conflict in that period, but he also was a member of, believe it or not, an interracial council of clergy who were interested in dealing with the race problem. And this is in the teens, just the early part of the 20th century. By the time he writes Moral Man and Immoral Society, about a decade after, he writes a chapter in there on the race problem in the United States. It's a very searching critique of the race problem in the United States and almost an anguished discussion of how can we possibly address this problem given the enormous power which is invested in racist institutions. Now, I bring that up for the following reason. That was a very important influence on the thought of Martin Luther King Jr. Coming along somewhat later, he was, some would say, almost educated by Niebuhr about political ethics through that book. The other book I want to call to your attention is a book by Richard Niebuhr, his brother, called The Social Sources of Denominationalism. It's an angry book because basically what it says is the denominations exist, separate it's a hard book for me to read, given my strong convictions about the Reformed tradition and its value. But he says denominations to a large extent exist because of the capitulation of Christians to social forces and cultural forces that are dominating their lives. And he goes on to say the separate existence of white churches and black churches is theologically indefensible. Let me say that again. The separate existence of white churches and black churches is theologically indefensible. I don't care what else you say about them, it's theologically indefensible. He said that in the 1930s, at a time when not exactly everybody was saying that sort of thing. Now, the theological seminaries were producing these ideas starting in the early 20th century, the 1900s, if you will. But the other thing which really was a kind of incubator for a set of ideas which led to the criticism of a serious criticism and eventually action against segregation was the ecumenical movement. The ecumenical movement beginning with the creation of the Federal Council of Churches in 1908. The Federal Council of Churches was the forerunner of what became the National Council of Churches. And of course, there was the parallel organization of the World Council of Churches. The Federal Council of Churches, from the start, was influenced by the kind of ideas I've just been discussing. It was heavily influenced by the social gospel. It was heavily influenced by neo-orthodoxy of the Niebuhrian kind. That was part of what moved it in the direction of becoming a source of agitation against segregation. But the other thing, an even more important thing in my judgment, was this. From the start, its membership included black churches. Let me say that again. 1908, the membership made up of the different denominations, the membership of the Federal Council of Churches included all the major black denominations. So there they sat at the same table. And it was not long before they began agitating against segregation, starting with a very modest step, but I've oftentimes wondered how this was received. They began in 1922. It took a while. Keep in mind, there are things to distract their attention and so forth for a while, but eventually in 1922, on a regular basis, the Federal Council of Churches asked its member churches to ask their members in congregations to celebrate every year Race Relations Sunday. Now, Race Relations Sunday was an occasion to ask the question, are we treating one another in the right way? What does the gospel have to say about race relations? And it became a kind of lever for pushing people to think about this topic. I don't want to exaggerate the importance of that, but insofar as any significant voice, let alone action, appeared in this period, questioning from a theological point of view segregation. It seems to me that's one of the main sources of it. And the fact that it was being done so widely, the Methodists were doing it, the Baptists were doing it, the Lutherans were doing it, etc. But the real progress, and here I'm going to try, Arlene, in 2 or 3 minutes to finish this up. The real turning point begins to emerge in the late 1940s. In the late 1940s, historians looking at the history of segregation in the United States just commonly, almost routinely say the Second World War had a profound effect upon the rethinking that took place eventually with regard to segregation. Keep in mind that it was in the immediate aftermath of the Second World War that Harry Truman did something I think extraordinary. By executive order, desegregated the military. Think about the enormity of that. Just desegregated the military, which up to that point had been, but not only that, he desegregated the civil service as well, reversing Wilson's previous action. Now, just imagine the ripple effect of that as you begin to sort of desegregate one operation after another, training of troops and so forth, all the way through the elaborate institutions of the military. There were other things that happened in that period, but that was just a huge turning point. In 1948, you might say almost in response to that, you can just imagine the debates that were beginning to take place. We can imagine debates that were oftentimes taking place in Presbyterian churches right in this area, given all the military presence in this area. In 1948, the the PCUSA General Assembly had a long statement about race relations in this country, which concluded with this observation, this claim. Our aim, our goal as a church is to bring about a desegregated church in a desegregated society. 1948, a desegregated church in a desegregated society. Now, they had some intimation there of what that might mean, but that statement alone was provocative. And then that set the stage for something which is even more momentous, I think. In 1954, you get, you might say, the sequel to Harry Truman's action, and that's the famous decision of the Supreme Court, hugely important in the whole history of our country, the Brown decision with regard to the desegregation of public schools. A decision which was like a Molotov cocktail thrown into the middle of American society. It said, in effect, segregation in the public schools is illegitimate. It's unconstitutional. It has to stop. Now, the interesting thing about that from a church point of view is the following. Presbyterians and most of the member churches of the Federal Council of Churches responded to that with pronouncements rather soon, which said, we approve of that decision and we commend it to our members as something which they should embrace and endorse and see and facilitate its implementation. Presbyterians were not alone in that. Most of the member denominations of the federal, then by that time the National Council of Churches took similar statements, but it was a reflection of a kind of mood that was developing in the country, the early 1950s. Indeed, some people responding to that, looking at that, thought, wow, we may be on the threshold here of a fundamental transformation in American life for the better. But as we know, the story as it evolved subsequently was more complicated. And I want to say, anticipating something I'm going to be discussing in much greater length next time, even though the Presbyterians and others, I don't want to limit it to the Presbyterians, took, I would say, rather not just praiseworthy, but in a sense, noble statements. A desegregated church in a desegregated society. We affirm the Brown decision. These are rather strong, good statements. There was little action coming from the church to support that until certain things happened. And here I'm, Arlene, on the threshold of a conclusion. Until certain things happened. And here are the three things I want to mention. Number one, the churches did not act in any meaningful way until the following. There was very, very soon, it took a few years, but there was evidence of militant opposition to the Brown decision in the South. And then, of course, in the wider country. So the first thing that happens to begin to, you might say, get the churches thinking seriously about, we got to do something, is this militant negative response to the Brown decision. The formation of white citizens councils, massive resistance in the state of Virginia. And the creation of these schools that are independent of the public schools, so we don't have to do any desegregation, etc. By the way, a resistance which went on for several decades. Second, as that played out, it created a kind of crisis, a constitutional crisis in the United States, especially as certain important public figures, Faubus, Wallace, a whole series of other names we all know, began to step up and actively campaign for active resistance to the Supreme Court decision. And the Supreme Court and the federal judiciary on the whole, to their credit, stuck by their guns and said, this has got to happen. This has got to happen year after year after year with mounting opposition. And that led to recognition as early as 1957, when Eisenhower sent the troops into Little Rock, that the federal government was going to have to act to support and enforce the Supreme Court decision. Otherwise, the Supreme Court decision would be idle. Eisenhower, another Presbyterian, I have to say, although nothing like Woodrow Wilson, was very reluctant to do that. But eventually he took that action. And of course, that moves the federal government into the position of playing a highly active role in the civil rights struggle that follows. The third thing, however, and the most important of all, is this. Beginning in 1955 with the Montgomery bus boycott, suddenly there begins to appear this movement led by Black clergy, but with very strong support from Southern Black Protestants, of active resistance to the resistance and insistence on change on the part of those people, Martin Luther King and literally dozens of others, which puts the white Protestants in a very interesting position. Are you going to support those Black Protestants who are clearly, very assertively establishing opposition to any sort of reversal of the Brown decision? And that leads to what I'm going to characterize next time as a kind of shining moment in the history of American Presbyterianism in dealing with this problem. That comes mainly in the 1960s, but that's for next week. Let me stop.
Wow.
And I apologize, I went a little longer than I had anticipated.
I'm just allowing a moment for us to just let some of that sink in. So much you have put into context. And I want to invite your questions in the chat. I'm going to add Nancy as our spotlight her. She's going to help to manage and watch for your questions.
Okay.
Were there any churches in the period of segregation that did experiment with integration, would you say?
Well, let me mention, I'm going to answer that in two parts. I have talked about mainline Presbyterians. I want to talk about one splinter church, small Presbyterian church, which has a very different history on this topic. The initials are UPNA, United Presbyterian Church in North America, created in the 18th century. It was a group of Covenanter, Scots Covenanter people who settled mainly in the area of the Midwest from Western Pennsylvania through Illinois. They resisted being part of the larger denomination for various theological reasons. So they were always a small group. But interestingly, from the beginning, as soon as they got their church established in this country, and they had a theological seminary that they created in Pittsburgh and another one later farther west, they took the strong position, and it was easier for them because they were a small church, that slavery is wrong. Just full stop. It's wrong. And they did some of the things that the Quakers did. That is, they disciplined people who, for example, clergy who even hinted with approving of slavery could be disciplined and were disciplined. They were also active, let me just say parenthetically, because they're strategically nicely well placed. They had a lot of churches in Ohio, some in Indiana, to contribute to the Underground Railroad. They were kind of Presbyterian abolitionists. They didn't really identify very directly with the abolitionist movement for various reasons, but they had this very strong, kind of consistent anti-slavery position. They, even though their numbers were small, played a huge role in that migration south that I talked about after the Civil War for missionaries going south to educate Blacks. Now that church, once they got engaged with the Black community, took it for granted that they were going to have an integrated church. And did not have separate presbyteries, did not have separate synods. Now they would have synods in some parts of the country that were predominantly Black or predominantly white. And I think that was kind of a badge of honor for them, that they felt that first of all, the Southern Presbyterian Church was just wrong. And the Northern Church was compromised because it was not resolute in its opposition. So that's one example. I'm sure there were congregations, especially in the North, that in practice resisted being segregated. But I don't have more than an impression there. I can't give you more specific data. And keep in mind that there are only certain places where just the sheer demographics make a desegregated church experience likely. And I'm talking about, people today talking about church life say, unless you've got somewhere between 15 and 20% of the congregation is made up of people of a race other than the dominant race in that congregation, it's not a multiracial church. Well, there are only certain places where that would be really very possible. So I'm sorry, I can't give you a more specific answer to that, but I think that's interesting, that there is that splinter church that rather consistently held the line against the sorts of compromises that were sort of taken for granted in the larger church.
Okay, we have a couple questions here. We have a first one from Mary. Can you give some examples of the segregation laws and practices enacted in the 1890s and after?
Well, I'm sure all of you know that in a very public way, you had a separation of facilities, public facilities. I remember when I first went to college, coming from Ohio into Virginia, and I'm still amazed at the innocence, my own innocence, that I wasn't aware of segregation very much, and confronting a circumstance in which there were these signs, colored. Well, I remember the colored. I don't remember whether there was a white, but there probably was, for everything from drinking fountains to restrooms and on and on. So that was, I think that was a matter of law. I'm not sure, but I think it was. Seating arrangements in public transportation was another part of this, and that was by law. I've already said the Plessy versus Ferguson case was a case that had to do with the distinction that had been developed on railroad lines between white cars and Black cars. And the white cars, of course, were much better. They were more commodious. They were more luxurious. And that was challenged by a couple of Blacks. And the outcome of that case, of course, was that the legitimacy of that whole kind of arrangement was accepted. So you had public accommodations. You had laws regarding marriage. You had laws concerning education. You had laws concerning another part of it was what kind of facilities were available to whites and blacks in commerce. So there are a whole series of laws that really they covered, I think, virtually every, I'm tempted to say every significant domain of ordinary life except religion, but religion was taken for granted to be segregated.
Thank you. We have somebody in our congregation, Lynn Garvey Hodge, who is a reenactor, a historical reenactor, and we have a question from her. She says, having the honor to reenact Angelina Grimke, and she's also familiar with her nephews, I am more than familiar with Francis Grimke, who in 1884 married Frederick Douglass and his second wife, Helen Pitts. So his sense of integration was long and well lived. What scripture would Woodrow Wilson have used to defend his plan for segregation for the federal government offices? And she has a, by the way here, Francis and Brother Henry were also Lincoln University grads.
You know, there is a specific passage which I cannot recall the exact biblical citation, except to say that it includes the phrase separate habitations. And I will get that for you for next time. But just note, here's a particular biblical reference where you find a phrase, God has separated them and with their separate habitations. You have to work really hard to find that passage and then to interpret that passage in a way which is congenial with the outcome you want. That's the level we're talking about here. It's not like you've got a passage in which something is very clearly supportive of segregation. I must say, I said when we were talking about slavery, and I just want to say this again, I think that the biblical defense of slavery is you can understand why there would be so much debate about it, because it really is something that reasonable people could disagree about. I'm not talking about the merits of it, but just as biblical interpretation. Segregation, it seems to me, is a whole separate matter. And I think as I told you, there were even people who defended the institutions of segregation, believed in it very strongly, who said, you know, this is not really very biblical directly. It's got to be through some process of reasoning that leads us from certain biblical claims to this, which is a way of saying the defense of segregation on biblical grounds was shaky.
All right, and we have a question here from Kim, who says, I don't understand how Presbyterians reconciled working toward the education of and social advancement of Blacks and didn't actively stand up against segregation. It feels like a very strange chasm. How do you think this was justified?
Well, I think part of it was a kind of paternalism. I'm not saying all the people who were, well, let me just step back and say many of the people who were involved in education were not believers in segregation. They were working within those institutions. They, for whatever reason, thought the institutions were difficult to confront directly, challenge directly. So they would say things which clearly implied that they thought segregation was wrong, but given the fact that segregation was the world in which they lived, they would do everything they can to, shall we say, compensate for that. So I think a lot of the, especially the strong effort for education, was done by people who didn't believe very much in segregation. But I think once it became evident that that was something which was a going enterprise, and certainly the Black population responded very favorably to it, then they would probably justify it in the following way. Well, the Black church needs leaders. The Black community needs doctors. The Black community needs lawyers. The Black community needs whatever. And therefore, their judgment about this was a matter of preparing leadership for the Black community without really endorsing the idea that there should be any kind of breaking down of the separation between the races. A lot of it had to do with that, I think.
Thank you. I have a.
Let me
Okay.
one further thought about that, and that's the way it played out for a long time. You know, the Black doctor, the Black physician was the physician for the Black community, full stop. Sorry.
Okay, that's all right. We have a question here from James. How is apartheid in South Africa any different from segregation in the South?
Well, it's fascinating that the defenders of apartheid said again and again, this is segregation. What, to American critics, why do you why are you objecting to these institutions? We've got our own version of this, and I think to a large extent they were variations on the same thing, especially given the fact that in the days when segregation was legally enforced and actively enforced by the federal government, not to speak of the state governments.
I'm wondering, back to Kim's question, is it possible that while many might have believed that segregation was wrong, that they were benefiting from it, and that would, or was it just they were working within a system that just they couldn't see outside the system, that was the way things are, or maybe a little of both?
Yeah, that's the thought which crosses my mind, a little of both. We talk about white privilege. Certainly throughout both of these epochs that I've been discussing, white privilege is enormous. I've already talked in the session on slavery about the economic incentives for maintaining the institution of slavery, and they were large. I'm tempted to say enormous. Less so, to be sure, for people who were less well off, that is whites. But yes. Now, I think in segregation, it's very interesting. A lot of the political support for segregation in the South came from people who were lower middle class and below, whites. And I think this is not a new thought. This is something we've all heard before. A lot of the incentive for racism at that level is a status consciousness. I may not be well off, but I'm better off than those people. Now, how that translates into what I would characterize as racial hatred, and there's a lot of that mixed in there, is beyond my capacities to understand. I think that's a psychological dynamic which I just am not equipped to explain. And by the way, one of the interesting things is a lot of the sort of active enforcement of segregation in especially the early part of the 20th century came from pressure from people who previously characterized themselves as populists. In the 1890s, they were populists and they were supporters of what, in a certain sense, we would characterize today as progressive political ideas, which had been, on the whole, unsuccessful in the populist movement. And they became, many of them, fierce racists in the aftermath of the decline and fall of populism. Now, why would those people be racist? Well, part of the answer is what let me just come back and recapture that sentence. Why would people in that position be so hostile to blacks? I think the answer is what I said a moment ago. I think there's a status consciousness issue there, which is very important.
Arlene, we want to do one more question or go to our closing?
If there's one more question, we could take that for a couple minutes and then we'll wrap it up.
Okay. All right, so we have, this is also from Lynn. Lynn, even back to the time of Lyman Beecher in Cincinnati and Theodore Well, there was that great debate about gradualism and immediatalism. Pardon me if I can't even get that word right. Hence, Dr. Martin Luther King comment in his I Have a Dream speech about avoiding the tranquilizing drug of gradualism. This was the first half of the 19th century. Seems that thinking carried forth for a long time.
And persists. Absolutely. I said before, and I'll just say it again, through the whole debate about slavery, there were lots of people who said slavery is a bad thing, but we got to go slow. Got to go slow. Got to be gradual about this. And then I'm going to talk about this next week. Once the decree is handed down about the illegitimacy of school segregation, there's a lot of talk, and not just in the South, about the desirability of going slow. We can't do this too fast because da 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 da. So that is a kind of recurring white response to any attempt to take decisive action.
Thank you. We are going to move into our closing. I want to thank you so much for all you have taught us. I'm going to bring up two of our friends, and then I'm going to put up a screen share. James and Kim are going to close us with words from our confessions of 1967 in Belhar, which, while we have yet to fully live into them by a long shot, they are good ones to remember. So go ahead, James, if you want to start us off.
Okay. We believe that unity is both a gift and an obligation for the church.
God has created the peoples of the earth to be one universal family. The church is called to bring all people to receive and uphold one another as persons in all relationships of life, in employment, housing, education, leisure, marriage, family, church, and the exercise of political rights.
We reject any doctrine which sanctions in the name of the gospel or of the will of God the forced separation of people on the grounds of race and color, and thereby in advance obstructs and weakens the ministry and experience of reconciliation in Christ.
In each time and place, there are particular problems and crises through which God calls the church to act. The church, guided by the Spirit, humbled by its own complicity, and instructed by all attainable knowledge, seeks to discern the will of God and learn how to obey in these concrete situations.
We believe that God has revealed God's self as the one who wishes to bring about justice and true peace among people.
With an urgency born of this hope, the church applies itself to present tasks and strives for a better world.
Do not be afraid, for see, I am bringing you good news of great joy for all the people. May it be so. Amen.
Amen.
Amen.